Reading the Times for Thursday, January 2nd. Reading the Times for Thursday, January 2nd, 2020. Pro-Iranian protesters end siege of U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. After a second day of tense protests at the American Embassy in Baghdad, thousands of pro-Iranian demonstrators dispersed on Wednesday, ending a siege that had trapped American diplomats in the embassy compound overnight and winding down a potentially explosive crisis for the Trump administration. Despite a 16-year American effort to establish a government friendlier to Western interests at a cost of more than $1 trillion and 5,000 American lives, Iraq's leaders lined up in opposition to the American airstrikes, and its security forces allowed the militias to reach the American diplomatic compound. The American airstrikes set off a broad outcry in Iraq that the United States seemed not to have anticipated, and that now looks likely to precipitate an effort to expel all American forces. Trump bet he could isolate Iran and charm North Korea. It's not that easy. After 3 years of no international crises, Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, said on Tuesday, Mr. Trump is facing one with Iran because he has rejected diplomacy, and another with North Korea because he had asked too much of diplomacy. In neither case has Trump embraced traditional diplomacy, putting forward a partial or interim pact in which a degree of restraint which would be met with a degree of sanctions relief. Mr. Trump does not engage such arguments. Vice Admiral Gholam Zera Tehani of Iran was quoted in the Financial Times declaring that the most important achievement of these drills was the message that the Islamic Republic of Iran cannot be isolated. It is possible that the Trump administration's strategy will still bear fruit. Mr. Pompeo was doing everything he could in recent weeks to express support for Iranians who were mounting protests inside their own country. The Iranians have made clear what Mr. Trump needs to do to reopen negotiations, essentially return to the deal struck with Mr. Obama, largely by lifting sanctions Mr. Trump imposed starting in May 2018. Elizabeth Warren isn't talking much about Medicare for All anymore. In warm-up remarks introducing Senator Elizabeth Warren at campaign rallies, young volunteers often say they are supporting her because of her plan to transform the health care system through a single-payer Medicare for All program. Ms. Warren's campaign and its surrogates say that the type of insurance offered under their plan is more comprehensive than Mr. Biden's and Mr. Buttigieg's proposals, and that the Warren camp has provided more details about how to implement and finance a single-payer system than Mr. Sanders. In national polls released in the past 2 months, Ms. Warren has fallen behind Mr. Sanders, a fellow liberal on many issues, but also a vocal champion of single-payer health insurance, who has focused his candidacy on healthcare. In a homecoming video meant to unite campus, almost everyone was white. Students of color were upset. The university's administration was scrambling, and even many white students agreed that members of Alpha Kappa Alpha should have been included. Campus newspapers covered the story, and so did the Wisconsin State Journal, in which a headline declared, UW-Madison apologizes for now-deleted homecoming video of nearly all-white student body. The students of the homecoming committee continued with their planned week of events before the homecoming football game, hoping the furor would die down. Lori Reeser, the vice chancellor for student affairs, who is white, with students, every year there's 8,000 new ones and it's all brand new. And so we have to start it again. It's creepy. Unexplained drones are swarming by night over Colorado. Some have suggested they might be part of a simple mapping operation or a land survey conducted by an oil and gas company. But why would such flights run at night? Senator Cory Gardner, Republican of Colorado, said on social media that he would closely monitor the situation. A newspaper headline in Akron, Colorado, asked, "What's with the drones?" Multiple law enforcement agencies warned residents that shooting a drone out of the sky would be a crime. I've been in contact with the FAA regarding the heavy drone activity in eastern Colorado, and I'm encouraged they've opened up a full investigation to learn the source and purpose of the drones. Operators of all but the smallest drones have been required to register with the federal government since 2015. But there is no straightforward legal way for state and local officials to identify the owner of a particular drone or to track that drone's location. The lesson of an Albanian earthquake. The Balkans aren't ready for the big one. We only speak of about 300 buildings in danger of collapsing in Bucharest, said Matei Sumbasaco, the founder of Re-Rise, Romania's first non-governmental organization focused on reducing seismic risk. We know about another 1,600 buildings, and we don't know how many others there are. If a similar earthquake struck today, he said, the losses in terms of affected buildings and people killed would be at least as high as in 1977. We have buildings here in Bucharest that were affected by 1940 earthquake, and then the 1977 earthquake, and then the 1986 earthquake, he said. Some of the ground floors of those buildings got converted into stores, and they added an extra floor on top of the building, which might be considered an earthquake hazard, he explained in a phone interview, just hours ahead of a trip to Albania to evaluate whether some of the homes damaged by the November quake could be habitable again. Hong Kong protesters return to streets as New Year begins. Nearly a month of relative quiet abruptly ended on Wednesday with the sounds of protesters' chants and police officer tear gas rifles. The protesters have since expanded their demands to include a broad range of grievances, including greater democracy and an investigation of alleged police brutality. China's top leader, Xi Jinping, who has permitted a degree of public protest in Hong Kong that is unheard of on the mainland, mentioned the protest in his New Year's Day address, saying that Hong Kong's prosperity and stability is the wish of Hong Kong compatriots and the expectation for the people of the motherland. Pope Francis apologizes after slapping away a clingy pilgrim. Francis, visibly upset, slaps twice at the woman's hands to free himself, rebuking her, and then angrily turns away. In March, Francis repeatedly withdrew his hand from worshippers as they sought to kiss his ring. On the papal plane later that month, a reporter jokingly withdrew his hand as Francis sought to shake it, prompting a good-humored explanation from Francis that he had simply been looking out for people's health. Headscarf ban and carbon taxes. Austria gets an unlikely government. For Austria's Greens, who have never been in government at the national level, the coalition presents a chance to show that their party is capable of governing with an establishment conservative party at the top level. From the perspective of the Austrian People's Party, there is no other party that is ideologically further removed than the Greens, said Lorenz Enser-Jedinastik, a political scientist at the University of Vienna. After co-opting much of the far-right Freedom Party's anti-immigrant message, Mr. Kurz had in effect promised to rein in the party by bringing it into his last government. Mexico prison fight leaves at least 16 inmates dead. A fight in a prison in northern Mexico has left at least 16 inmates dead and 5 wounded, the local authorities said, in one of the worst outbreaks of violence in the country's troubled penal system for years. The authorities did not say how the fight started, but several Mexican news outlets reported that inmates from rival cartels had turned a dispute over a friendly soccer game into a deadly fight. In October, 6 inmates died in a clash between rival groups in a prison in the central state of Morelos. Netanyahu seeks immunity from Israeli corruption charges. Netanyahu knows he's guilty. He said the choice was between immunity before all else or the citizens of Israel before all else, between the kingdom of Netanyahu or the state of Israel. Mr. Netanyahu is accused of trading official favors worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Israeli media moguls for illicit gifts of cigars, champagne, and jewelry, as well as positive news coverage. Avigdor Lieberman, leader of the right-wing Israel Beitenu party that used to be allied with Mr. Netanyahu's Likud and whose votes Mr. Netanyahu would need, said on Wednesday night that he would not support Mr. Netanyahu's bid for immunity. Granting Mr. Netanyahu's immunity, Ms. Nevot said, would be a fatal blow to the rule of law and equality before the law. No lawmaker or minister has been granted immunity since the law was amended in 2005. Flying lanterns probably caused zoo fire in Germany, police say. 3 women who flew paper lanterns to celebrate the new year are under investigation after a zoo fire in Krefeld, Germany, killed dozens of animals and burned down a primate enclosure, the police said Thursday. The Krefeld Zoo said on its Facebook page on Wednesday that the fire had gutted the enclosure, calling it an unbelievable tragedy. Hours later, the zoo said only 2 apes in the enclosure had survived and were slightly injured. The chimpanzees Bali and Limbo miraculously survived the devastating fire, the zoo said. What Kim Jong-un's latest threats say about his Trump strategy. After Mr. Trump met with Mr. Kim in Singapore later that year, the president said the two fell in love. That moratorium remains the best outcome Mr. Trump can cite from his on and off diplomacy with Mr. Kim, one that the North Korean leader may be wary of yanking away too soon. Mr. Kim's new guidelines meant that North Korea will give up denuclearization talks with the United States, accept a prolonged standoff and sanctions as reality, and strengthen its self-empowerment, including its nuclear and missile capabilities, said Chong Song-chang, a senior analyst at South Korea's Sejong Institute. Mr. Kim does appear to be giving the hardline military a more prominent role in his government, even if it is unclear when and whether he will test an ICBM. North Korea's state news media recently reported that he was expediting the development of new weapons technologies, such as a solid fuel missile that is harder to intercept and a new submarine-launched ballistic missile. Pompeo cancels Ukraine trip amid protests at embassy in Iraq. On several occasions since the Ukraine affair became public in September, Mr. Pompeo has emphasized Mr. Trump's assertions that there should be investigations into unsubstantiated conspiratorial claims of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 presidential election and actions on Ukraine policy by former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., who is now a leading Democratic presidential candidate. The department had said Mr. Pompeo intended to reaffirm U.S. support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity on his trip, a reference to the years-long war that Ukraine is fighting against a Russian-backed insurgency in the east. Mr. Trump has not nominated an ambassador for Ukraine since he and Mr. Pompeo forced Ms. Yovanovitch to leave. Richard Jewell was wrongly implicated in a mass attack. He's not the only one. In the highly competitive news environment that follows a mass shooting, reporters sometimes fall for malicious disinformation online, such as after the school shooting in Parkland, Florida, or cite unnamed sources who may or may not be right. In his first statement to the press, perhaps 90 minutes after the shooting, Mr. Oates correctly told reporters that the only shooter was in custody, but slightly overstated the number of victims. Because mass shootings are so chaotic and unintentional mistakes have happened so frequently, police chiefs now make a point of qualifying their earlier statements. New injection method makes an old TB vaccine far more powerful. Even the weakened bacteria used in vaccines can be dangerous for people with HIV. BCG vaccine, like most vaccines made with live weakened virus, is not given to pregnant women, although it has not been shown to harm fetuses. Dr. Cedar has proposed testing the new injection method for the TB vaccine because he has used the same method in developing an experimental malaria vaccine made with irradiated parasites. In the introduction to a later study, Dr. Cedar said they described intravenous injection of vaccines as impractical for humans and instead endorsed giving BCG by aerosol mist. AI is learning to read mammograms. There are many radiologists who are reading mammograms who make mistakes, some well outside the acceptable margins of normal human error, Dr. Lehman said. We took mammograms that already happened, showed them to radiologists and asked, cancer or no, and then showed them to AI and asked, cancer or no, said Dr. Maziar Etemadi, an author of the study from Northwestern University. Although developers of AI often say that it is intended to help radiologists, not replace them, Dr. Lehman predicts that eventually computers alone will read at least some mammograms without help from humans. Pete Buttigieg's campaign says it raised $24.7 million in the fourth quarter. Mr. Buttigieg had also been criticized for courting wealthy donors, and in announcing his fundraising results, his campaign boasted of being powered by grassroots energy from all 50 states. His average donation in the quarter was roughly $34, the campaign said. In a memo released Wednesday, Mr. Buttigieg's campaign manager, Mike Schmuel, wrote that Mr. Buttigieg had solidified himself as a top-tier presidential candidate. In the fourth quarter, Mr. Buttigieg defended himself by criticizing what he described as purity tests, and he said that Democrats should not try to defeat President Trump with one hand tied behind our back. Earlier in December, Mr. Buttigieg opened his high-dollar fundraising events to news medias. He's not Mayor Pete anymore. Buttigieg's successor is sworn in. A Black Lives Matter group in South Bend has called a news conference for Saturday to highlight what it calls Mr. Buttigieg's tolerance for racism by police, intending to keep alive an issue that has apparently dampened Mr. Buttigieg's appeal to black voters nationally. The former mayor entered with his husband, Chasten Buttigieg, and his mother, Jennifer Ann Montgomery, a former professor at the University of Notre Dame. As the new mayor was introduced, Mr. Buttigieg's husband placed a hand on the former mayor's shoulder, who shot Mr. Mueller a broad smile. In a deadly start to 2020, gunfire erupts across America. In Cleveland, a man who news reports said was firing off rounds to celebrate the new year accidentally killed his girlfriend. Among the New Year shootings across the country, according to news and police reports, more than a dozen people were shot in Cleveland overnight, including at least one fatally. In Philadelphia, 2 people were killed on New Year's Eve. Kevin Spacey's accuser's estate dropped sexual assault lawsuit. Mr. Spacey paid no money to the plaintiff, Jennifer L. Keller, a lawyer for Mr. Spacey, said in an email on Tuesday night, the case's conclusion came less than a week after Ari Ben, a Scandinavian writer who had accused Mr. Spacey of groping him, died by suicide, according to the Norwegian news service NTB. Mr. Spacey's acting career, which includes a pair of Oscars, all but vanished after several people accused him of sexual misconduct. Netflix halted production of House of Cards. The series later resumed without Mr. Spacey and abandoned Gore, a completed film starring Mr. Spacey as Gore Vidal. Shock waves from American airstrikes in Iraq may have just begun. Iran-backed Shiite militias have been firing missiles at American troops and military contractors in Iraq for 6 months now, and last week they finally killed one of the Americans. Iraq, lacking a functional government, now finds itself trapped in a fray over which it has little control, compelled by public indignation to denounce the American airstrikes on its territory, but loath to lose the American counterbalance to Iran and its proxies. After Mr. Trump loudly pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and imposed tough sanctions on Iraq, it is hard to see what incentive he could dangle to prevent Iran and its proxies from further complicating the task of American forces in Iraq or elsewhere in the Middle East. A journalist's murder in Malta puts democracy on trial. At the time she was killed, Miss Caruana Galizia was reporting on the mysterious offshore companies that she said were linked to Maltese politicians. At a time when assaulting a free press has become the new normal, when reporters are rounded up in Turkey, killed in Russia, assassinated by Saudi rulers, or denounced as traitors by the President of the United States, the break in the case of Miss Caruana Galizia is encouraging signs that courageous reporting does matter. If reporters can be killed there with impunity, they can be killed anywhere. Already had plenty of Trump 2020? The site of the rally, the King Jesus International Ministry Church, has a large Hispanic congregation, and Pastor Guillermo Maldonado has told his parishioners to come to hear Trump's speech even if they don't have papers. Explaining his confidence, Maldonado just said, "I'm not that dumb." Perhaps he's been following the record of Trump's businesses, which have been rather low energy about checking for undocumented workers. Factcheck.org looked into the matter and determined Trump was referring to a 2013 dinner hosted by County Republican Party organization, which presented him with token gifts, including a statuette of Abraham Lincoln. But apparently Trump did not get any special commendations, let alone a Man of the Year award. On the night he was being impeached, that would be during the Michigan rally, Trump went on a rant about low-flow toilets that he claimed required flushing 10 times. He then pointed to a supporter in the crowd and said, "Not me, of course, not me, but you, him." Do you think that guy went home and told his family that the President of the United States picked him out as a person who required a lot of water when he went to the bathroom? Would he have been astonished, embarrassed, horrified? Whatever it was, sir, we all know how you feel. Every moment with my son is an act of creation. My father has taught me that it is never too late to say I love you. Getting older and becoming a father myself, I realize that time is elastic. The act of writing requires writers to give enormous amounts of time and love. Writers must love writing, must love their creations, must love their characters, no matter what they do. How to protect New York's Jews? The question is, what can be done to protect the Jews of Greater New York? An effective, multi-pronged response needs to involve the Jewish community in all of its diversity and the greater public, as well as the city and state governments. Jewish institutions must continue to make themselves more resilient by improving access control and making use of some of the recent New York State grant funding allocated for schools, community centers, and camps, with a determined focus on deterrence, resolving mental health treatment deficiencies, creating juvenile rehabilitation programs, defending houses of worship and other Jewish institutions. We can begin to beat back the persistent violence that is afflicting New York's Jewish community. Rethinking how we choose candidates. A series of 5 regional primaries spread from February to June, with rotation of order every 4 years, should replace the mishmash of the current system. David Leonard's column points out certain aspects of the primary system that make no sense and resulted in Donald Trump's nomination. David Leonard's is right to criticize the current primary system for selection of candidates, but partisanship itself is the problem. Coaching female athletes and gender inequality. As a former Stanford University athlete and now a faculty athletic representative at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I read a women's sport ruled by male coaches with great interest. It is not surprising that a male coach fumbled to answer the question of why there are not more women in top coaching jobs. Promoting gender equality and diversity in coaching through mentorship, role modeling, sponsorship, and opportunity should raise the bar for everyone. Can collectors, nuisance or public service? New York's bottle bill is a litter prevention and recycling success. The Redemption Center could be required to send material to recycling companies that the city has contracts with. The state bottle bill is effective in preventing plastic containers from being littered and entering water bodies. 90,000 Jews gather to pray and defy a wave of hate. For the past century, thousands of Jews have participated in a shared and daunting religious feat, reading the same page of the Talmud every day until they finish all 38 volumes of that central text of Jewish religious law and rabbinical debates. An estimated 350,000 Jews all over the world take part in the movement known as Daf Yomi, which means page a day in Hebrew. On Saturday, a gathering of Orthodox Jews lighting candles for 7th night of Hanukkah at a rabbi's home in the New York suburb of Monsey was invaded by a man wielding a machete. Victim of anti-Semitic rampage is unlikely to awake from coma, family says. If our father does miraculously recover partially, the statement added, doctors expect that he will have permanent damage to the brain, leaving him partially paralyzed and speech impaired for the rest of his life. The stabbing attack occurred in a Hasidic rabbi's home in Monsey, New Jersey, a hamlet about 30 miles northwest of New York City, with a large community of ultra-Orthodox Jews. In rare cases, federal prosecutors in New York have said they would seek the death penalty, as in the case of Seyfulo Seipov, a Uzbek man charged in a 2017 truck attack that killed 8 people on a crowded Manhattan bike path. Mr. Newman's arm was shattered in the attack, the statement said, but his condition is so dire that no surgery has yet been performed on the right arm. The 4 other victims of the attack have all been released from the hospital. More people are dying on New York City streets. What went wrong? As New York City tackled the suburban problem of street safety in recent years, it earned praise for pushing down traffic deaths to their lowest level in a century and helped begin a national movement to make roads safer for pedestrians and cyclists. Years of progress could be in jeopardy. The number of traffic deaths rose in 2019, fueled by a spike in cyclist fatalities that has devastated and angered the city's vibrant biking community. The troubling statistics have raised doubts about Mayor Bill de Blasio's signature plan to improve street safety and prompted the city council to embrace an ambitious effort to add 250 miles of protected bike lanes to break the car culture. While numbers can fluctuate from year to year, the figures highlight how difficult it is to reduce deaths in a crowded city with a dangerous mix of impatient drivers, droves of pedestrians, and cyclists who are often vulnerable to traffic. China moves to steady its slowing economic growth. China on Wednesday moved to pump more cash into its financial system, suggesting that Beijing remained concerned about faltering growth despite signs that the world's second largest economy was stabilizing. China's central bank, the People's Bank of China, announced that it would inject about $115 billion into the economy by freeing up banks to lend more money. With China's economy seeing record levels of corporate borrowing, it said, is this as good as it gets? The Chinese economy has also been hit by Mr. Trump's trade war. A restaurant with no leftovers. There are financial incentives for restaurants to invest in these zero waste practices, with one study finding that restaurants save on average $7 for every $1 invested in kitchen food waste reduction practices. The National Restaurant Association found that around half of diners say they are beginning to consider establishments' efforts to recycle and reduce food waste when choosing where to eat. Restaurants close all the time, too, so the last thing they're going to think about is, am I going to use single-use plastic? Though Redora is striving to ensure its space is zero waste, the system isn't perfect. The tech that will invade our lives in 2020. Anything in the home will have more cameras, more mics, more sensors. If some of this sounds like the same as last year, it is, but that's because new technologies often take time to mature. Smart home products work well, but they are complicated to set up, so people use virtual assistants just for basic tasks like setting a kitchen timer and checking the weather. In all, digital video made up about a quarter of the daily time spent on digital devices last year, which included time spent on apps and web browsers. The market surged last year. Don't expect the same in 2020. Stocks are more expensive than a year ago on a host of different measures. One of the most commonly used is how a stock's price compares to its profit over the preceding year. The elections could provide some interesting opportunities for investors, particularly in the first half of the year. Volatile markets, where prices are swinging higher and lower, are interesting opportunities, Ms. Thompson said, because she can use them to buy stocks she likes at lower prices. Pika who? How Pokemon Go confused the Canadian military. More than 3 years later, Canadian military officials have shared internal documents with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation news network that show how the military, both curious and confused, reacted to the widely popular app. Major Jeff Monaghan, an official based in Kingston, Ontario, wrote in an email, "Please advise the commissioners that apparently Fort Frontenac is both a Poke Gym and a Pokestop. I will be completely honest in that I have no idea what that is." At least 3 military police officers stationed at different bases were assigned to wander around with smartphones and notepads in hand to search for Pokemon, Pokestops, and Pokegyms, according to the document. The game and the unusual civilian behavior it brought was met with mixed reactions across Canada's military bases, according to the document. Financial tug-of-war emerges over fire victims' settlement. In the meantime, the $13.5 billion settlement leaves open just how much would be used to compensate victims, the lawyers and federal and state agencies, for the money they spent on rescue and recovery operations. Lawyers for the fire victims have asked the judge to reduce the government agency's claims and argued in one court filing that the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services can't recover the costs of carrying out public services such as response to fires. People are still hurting. I know a woman whose house burned down. She's living in a trailer with an autistic child and the generator and plumbing went out. She has no heat, no water, and she's freezing. Attorneys for the victims said they hope to work out several key issues, including how the trust for the fire victims will be managed and the process for submitting claims by the end of January. And this has been Reading the Times for Thursday, January 2nd, 2020. Reading the Times for Thursday, January 2nd, 2020.